Hi, my name is Cayman Mitchell, and I'm here to critique Arkin's ethical governor concept. I know many, as Dr. Bolton said, many of you have already mentioned it, have already discussed some of the issues with distinction and proportionality, but it certainly bears repeating because I think it's an important part. And my research is specifically based on the technical side of his work, so I'll be taking that perspective. So first, I think it's important to just get a summary of what the ethical governor actually does for those of you who do not have a computer science background. So essentially, Arkin goes through these 5 steps before an autonomous system can engage a target. So responsibility and military necessity will be determined by a human before the mission. A commander will determine who's responsible for this particular mission, will determine what's an appropriate target, and will somehow convey that to a programmer, which will add that to the ethical governor. Then next comes discrimination, which is performed by the robotic system as a whole, not by the ethical governor itself. It must discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. And then finally, the 4th and 5th steps are where the ethical governor actually comes into play, analyzing the principle of double intention and of proportionality to determine whether or not that particular attack is ethical, and only then will the target be engaged. So one can envision a set of all of the possible behaviors that a robot can take. So this includes lethal behaviors, non-lethal behaviors, directional changes, even strategic changes. All of those are the set of behaviors that the robot can do. A subset of this, obviously, is all of the lethal behaviors, which is what we're concerned about here. And a further subset of that is all the lethal behaviors that are actually ethical. So the ethical governor is intended to limit the robot's behavior to the dark blue and the light blue, essentially not allowing it to perform lethal, unethical behavior. So just as a general summary of his concept, essentially the robot system makes a decision, then the ethical governor, which is an external component, it's attached to basically the existing robotic system. It checks against ethical constraints, against the laws of war, against the rules of engagement, and then it acts only if it is obligated to, i.e. it must not break any ethical constraints, but it must also be required by the military objective in that particular situation. So now let's turn to the issues, which I've broken into 2 broad categories of implementation and then violations of humanitarian law. So with implementation, the first thing, probably the most important thing to note about the ethical governor is that it does not make ethical decisions. It only checks the ethicality of decisions already made. Now, this is extremely problematic for 2 reasons. One, it cannot check or double check the assessment that the rest of the system has made. If the robotic system has incorrectly identified a civilian as a combatant, the ethical governor cannot double check this. It only sees that that person is considered a combatant by the system. Second, you have the potential of, because ethics are not built into the decision structure, you have the potential of the rest of the system not even considering ethics when it's making its decision. Now, Arkin argues that the process of decision-making should include ethics, but then you run into another problem with possibly defining the ethical situation too early. So maybe the system sees one ethical dilemma in a situation, and by the time it makes its decision, another ethical situation has arisen that is unseen by this ethical governor concept. Second, it treats the ethical constraints in war as static. So the last presentation, you mentioned that Arkin talks a lot about this being like the game of chess, that robots can beat humans at chess, and so eventually robots will be able to be more ethical than humans on the battlefield. But this comparison is extremely problematic because the game of chess is an extremely structured environment. The rules are the same for the entire game. The beginning, middle, and end, no matter how many pieces are still on the board, the pieces can only move in specific ways. But the laws of war are not nearly as static. One can imagine a situation where a child soldier is pointing a weapon at American forces, say, and the robot would see this soldier, would see someone holding a weapon threatening to use it against them, and would most likely fire. A human, however legal this decision may be to fire upon the child, could easily think of his family back home, could make an easier decision, could make a a decision to absolve the situation in a more peaceful way that the robot would not even consider. So that shows that even though that soldier may have been justified in firing upon the child, humans' ethical considerations vary considerably based on context. Third is the inability of the ethical governor to deal with rapidly changing situations. This is very important in urban environments where civilians are coming to and fro. One can imagine the robotic system looking at a target that's near a road with cars driving by every now and then. And as the ethical governor is deciding whether or not this issue is proportional, whether it should be ethical to fire, a school bus drives into the picture. Now, if the robotic system is not quick enough to accommodate this new stimuli, to accommodate the new issues of proportionality, then it could potentially make an extremely unethical decision. And finally, Arkin consistently, throughout all of his work, treats human emotions as negative. He consistently says that humans can be fearful, they can be angry, they can act out of revenge, but he refuses to acknowledge many of the benefits of human emotion, that of compassion, that of empathy, that of guilt, that enable humans to make more ethical decisions. So now I'd like to turn to issues of humanitarian law, which Dr. Sarro mentioned quite extensively, so I'll try and go through them quickly. But first is the issue of distinction. Now, it's important to note that Arkin admits this must be self-first. The ethical governor does not handle issues of distinction, and he fully admits that if robotic systems cannot successfully distinguish between targets and civilians, that this is a moot point. The ethical governor will not do anything. And this is really an issue in modern warfare. One could imagine that eventually, considering a traditional battlefield scenario, if someone was wearing a uniform, if they were holding a weapon, a visual system would most likely be able to identify them correctly as a soldier or not. But in issues in urban environments where soldiers are not necessarily carrying weapons, where they may be dressed in civilian clothing, this becomes an extremely problematic issue. And finally is the issue of intention. Humans must have hostile intention to be considered a valid target in war. And this requires human analysis of subtle changes of emotion, subtle changes of behavior that robots can simply not analyze because they are not human. So second is the issue of proportionality, which Arkin certainly argues is a quantifiable metric. You can see actually the military moving further and further in this direction. Recently, I think, releasing a directive that said, a high-value target is worth 20 civilians or is worth 30 civilians. But I think that the issue of proportionality is extremely, extremely subjective. It requires human value calculations, as Dr. Asaro says, because you're evaluating abstract concepts of military necessity, military importance, and concepts of collateral damage, which can't be quantified into a number of lives or the amount in dollars of property damage. It simply can't be quantified in that way. And now, I would add that however politically incorrect this may be, I don't think most humans on the battlefield see all lives as equal. This is certainly the case with combatants. Some combatants are far more valuable military targets than others, but it could be true with the case of civilians as well. If the president of a country is one of the 5 civilians possibly injured by an attack, it would be much less likely to be considered proportional by a human. So now that we've looked at these issues, the question must be asked that Arkin poses, can robots be more ethical than humans? Arkin certainly believes that they can, while I would argue certainly that they cannot. And I would appeal to 3 main points for this. First is the issue of testing. And I would appeal to the precautionary principle, which states that if a system has the potential to do harm on civilians, then the burden of proving that it won't is on the manufacturer. And this simply requires testing, which cannot be done in these types of complex systems. Sometimes they're only tested stateside in situations far from a battlefield. But even if they are tested on a battlefield, you cannot possibly experience the range of stimuli that the robot may receive in a particular situation. And I don't think that if you cannot know that the robotic system will not fire upon civilians incorrectly, then it is unethical to deploy such a system in a battlefield scenario. Now, Arkin would come back at this and say that, well, they will be more ethical than humans humans, but I don't think that is an appropriate judgment to assign to a robot. Second, then, Arkin often argues, as I mentioned earlier, that humans are blinded by emotion, where I would argue that they are restrained by emotion. And further, he mentions the issue of self-preservation, which robots are obviously not inhibited by, so he argues that if a robot must sacrifice itself to save a civilian, then it certainly could. But he fails to consider the positive side of this. Self-preservation can actually inhibit soldiers from being too aggressive, from taking inappropriate actions that might damage their ability to preserve. And then finally, the question must be asked, are emotions fundamentally inseparable from ethics? Some philosophers certainly believe this, and if it is true, then by removing emotions from robots, Arkin is therefore removing ethics, if human ethics are inherently based on human emotions. And I would mention one last example to this. In a recent study, they asked civilians, members of the general public, whether they would flip a switch to redirect toxic fumes from a room with 5 children to a room with 1. Almost all of them said yes. But when the same people were asked whether they would be willing to kill one healthy individual to harvest his organs and save 5 sick, dying individuals, almost all of them said no. Now, the logic here, the rational, quantifiable logic, is exactly the same. Kill 1, save 5. And this is exactly what the robot would see this quantifiable situation. They would see the situations as the same. But humans see these situations as vastly different, and know that there are different ethical issues at stake in both situations. So in conclusion, Arkin's concept of the ethical governor does not meet the requirements of humanitarian law, of implementation issues, and cannot be considered a successful solution to providing autonomous robots with ethics. Thank you.